So it looks like most people who are joining have gotten on, so we'll probably get started here with our first stage for finances. We're going to try to keep this high level because we realize that we're getting residents with varying degrees of knowledge and background in finances. So hopefully we cover pretty important key topics that help you ultimately set yourself on a path to grow your wealth over the long term. But if we don't address anything during this that you have a specific question on or is more personal to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to help. As background, I'm Rob Michael, and I'm here with Carol Ann Fernandez. We're co-founders of alooola. So we're part of a larger organization that oversees around $4.5 billion in assets. But alooola specifically is focused on providing financial education and advice to young professionals, especially in the medical field. So with that, I'll hand it off to Carol, who will walk you through what we're going to actually talk about today.
So as Rob said, we're going to try to keep things pretty high level. We tried to choose topics that we thought would be relevant and interesting to most people. But again, feel free to reach out to us if we want to dig in more to anything. We thought we'd start out with investing since it is a financial webinar. Should you be doing it? How do you do it? Of course, we want to talk about taxes because now that incomes are rising either in residency or afterwards, you probably want to figure out how to pay less of them if possible. And then debt is always a big one. How to either pay it off or invest it, since I know a number of you probably are dealing with debt. And then the last two we know won't apply to everyone, but we do get a lot of questions from our clients on it. So we thought it'd be interesting to spend a few minutes on both houses and children. So to dig right in, starting with investing, what's the difference between saving and investing? Because most people have bank accounts and are saving to some extent and may feel like they are investing. A savings account is what you have at your bank. It's usually easy cash. You can get money out of the ATM. Money's insured, pretty protected. But as we've all seen, interest rates are virtually at zero right now, meaning you're not really gaining any money. And you may even be losing to inflation. A lot of you probably are if too much money is sitting there. But that being said, there is definitely a vehicle and use for bank accounts. So a savings or checking account you should probably have what we call an emergency fund in it. So essentially, anywhere from 3 to 6 months worth of expenses sitting in your bank account. Since you're residents, a lot of you don't really have a fear of losing your job, to be honest. So you may not need a full 6 months. However, if you're married and you have children, you may need a full 6 months. You can talk to us to try to figure out the exact number, but you do want to have some emergency fund if the car was to break down or if you just have a medical emergency or anything to be able to pull that. The other side of things is investing, which we're going to focus mainly on in this webinar. So investing is more long-term focused. The idea is you're putting money in and you're letting it be invested in a way that will hopefully give you more later. It involves some risk in order to get that reward. And so there's potential of much higher return than what's sitting in the bank account, but it also is longer term. And one of the things that we wanted to point out is really no other big vehicles that have done as well as the S&P 500. So investment vehicles. The average S&P 500 return since 1928 has been around 7%. So as you can see on this chart, some years it's obviously much higher than that, but other years it's much lower than that. But it averages around 7%. And that's where coming for that long-term focus is really important, because if you're just putting it in the market and going to pull it out in 6 months to a year, you may actually end up on a year where it's really down and that can hurt you. But if you're putting the money in and going to let it sit there for long term, whether that's 5 or 10 or even 30 years, the market really will over the long term outdo anything else. One of the things we hear a lot, especially from residents, is I don't have that much money. And so we can't really afford to be putting money in the market. Either I need to be paying off debt or I just don't have that much left over at the end of the month to even do what I want to do. What we want to illustrate here is this fact you don't need a lot of money to be investing. You can be putting in a small amount of money. And again, if you let it sit there and ride for the long term, you'll do very well. So let's say you're 25 years old and put in $200 a year, which when you break that down to a weekly basis is basically buying your coffee on the way to the hospital. And you let it sit in the market until you're age 65, you're going to have over $25,000 in the market at the end of it. Now, if you do the same thing, but you wait till you're age 35, so 10 years later, and you still put in $200 a year, you'll make over $14,000. So it's not to say that you won't make any money and you've lost out. You did lose out on over $9,000 worth of free money, essentially, that compound effect, just by waiting those 10 years. So this isn't to say if you're over 25, you're in trouble and don't even bother. It's more just to illustrate this point is even if you can only put in a little bit, the earlier you start, the better.
One of the things that we often get frustrated with in the financial industry in general is that a lot of terminology is thrown out there. And frankly, I think the medical field is a little bit like that as well. But sometimes these terms and definitions that people aren't aware of or understand, I encourage people just to walk away, right? Not even to try or get involved. So we thought, let's start by ignoring all these terms you've heard, hedge funds, options, ETFs, mutual funds. We'll cover all that eventually, but let's just start with the fundamental basic building blocks of what most people think of when they talk about investing, right? And you really have these two asset classes. You have stocks and bonds. And the way I would think of stocks is that if you buy one stock of Johnson & Johnson, you are literally an owner of Johnson & Johnson. It may not feel like you're an owner. You may not be a very big owner. You could own 0.0001% of Johnson & Johnson, but you are an owner. And what that means is if you bought that stock initially for $10, right? And Johnson & Johnson is doing really well. They're producing a lot of Tylenol. They come out with COVID vaccine. Maybe because they're doing so well and their revenue is growing, other people want to become owners of Johnson & Johnson. So when you go to sell that stock, maybe you bought it for $10, but now it's worth $50, right? That someone else is willing to pay you $50. And that's where that appreciation in price is where a lot of people make their money in stocks, right? Now, the reverse is also true. If Johnson & Johnson is doing really poorly, maybe you go to sell it and now it's only worth $5 when you bought it for 10, right? So there's that volatility aspect. But at least historically, large US corporations have done very well over the long term, despite that volatility. And you can kind of see that on the bottom graph. Bonds, on the other hand, are essentially pieces of debt, right? Using the same example, if Johnson & Johnson is doing really well and they want to expand and build another factory, but they don't have the money to do it, what they'll do is they'll go out to the community and say, can you loan us $100? And in a year, we'll pay you back that $100 plus an additional $2. So total, you'll get $102. I'm using completely arbitrary numbers here. But the point being, as long as you don't think Johnson & Johnson is going to go out of business, that's an extremely safe investment because, essentially it's a debt payment where you're going to earn an extra $2 for loaning them that money, right? And that's what a bond is. It's a little bit more income oriented, and it's a much more conservative investment as long as the company doesn't go out of business or default on their debt. And that's why you can see on the bottom graph, it's much more stable in terms of its line. There's less volatility, but over the long term, at least, it doesn't grow as much. So the question then becomes, well, how should we be allocating our money, right? And this partially depends on three things. One is your risk tolerance. You just get really nervous by having money in the stock market. Well, that's something that you shouldn't discount, right? The second is what type of investment or account you're putting the money into, right? If it's a retirement account, well, you don't need to touch it for maybe 3 or 4 decades as a resident. So you can afford to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of setting it up for growth. The third is really what type of investments you're making, right? And what your age is. One of the things we did on this chart here is basically said, just looking at age and assuming that you're not going to touch this money until you're in retirement, here's a hypothetical, not a recommendation, but just a hypothetical allocation. And as you can see, the longer your time frame is, when you're 30, you have a very long time frame, the more aggressive you can be in terms of putting your money in equities or stocks. Equities is just another word for stocks. As you get closer to retirement and even in retirement, you're going to want to bring that proportion down proportionally. The next question is, okay, that's great. I understand what stocks and bonds are, but I'm a resident and I don't have that much money to invest. How should I best invest that money? So again, using an illustration, if you had $425 and you wanted to buy stocks, you really don't have enough money to buy a lot of stocks. So you might only buy 2 stocks, which would be Nike and Facebook. The problem with that is that you're taking a lot of risk. So if Nike comes out with a scandal and the stock price plummets, well, that's close to half your investment that plummets with the stock of Nike. Whereas if you instead buy a mutual fund or ETF, you're diversifying yourself away from that risk. And just to take a step back, essentially what a mutual fund or ETF is a fund that you put all $425 into, but underneath that fund, it invests in hundreds of different stocks. So you're only buying one mutual fund or one ETF, but that one mutual fund or one ETF has hundreds of stocks within it. So you get exposure to hundreds of stocks without needing enough money to buy one share in each of those stocks. As a result, your risk is lower, and it tends, at least historically, to be a better way for investors who are just starting out to start investing. Because I had mentioned ETFs and mutual funds, and What is the difference between the two? Originally, when this all started, mutual funds were really the only game in town. You wanted to get a diversified portfolio and you didn't have that much money. Mutual funds were really all you could invest in. Recently, ETFs have come out and they're essentially, this is a oversimplification, but they're essentially just mutual funds, but they tend to be a little bit lower cost. So for a lot of reasons, we put them on here, which is they have lower fees. You can trade them at any time of the day, unlike mutual funds, which can only trade at the end of the day, and they're more tax efficient. ETFs we generally recommend over mutual funds. We can talk about that in more detail, but as you're starting, if you can, we focus more on ETFs than mutual funds. Okay, so now we've kind of established what the differences are between equities and bonds. We've established where you should be allocating, what proportion into equities, what proportion to bonds, and how you can think about that. We've talked about how you can get better exposure and diversification through mutual funds or ETFs with a slight preference to ETFs. Now the question is, okay, that's all great, but how do I actually go from where I am today to investing tomorrow? What you're really asking there is who or what platform or what company should I work with and create an investment account with so I can start to do this? A lot of people have different ways of looking at it. We think the most helpful is looking at who you are. So if you are what we call a do-it-yourself person, you genuinely enjoy reading about the stock markets and researching companies and looking at their balance sheets and income statements and kind of really understanding what you're investing in, well, then maybe you should go to a platform like E-Trade or Robinhood, because essentially it is oriented towards individual investors who want to do the work themselves and trade themselves. One caveat here is that nothing in life is free. A lot of people say, oh, that platform is free. It's not actually free. There's different ways they make their money, and we can talk about that at the end as well. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but just know that everything has a cost. So just understand where the fee or the cost is when you create a relationship with one of these companies. The second category is what we call investment only. These are companies that are more oriented to people who really just want to set their money and forget about it. They don't ever really need to interact with anyone. They don't have a lot of financial questions. They just really want their investments to start, and then that's it. In this case, a lot of times it's helpful to use a robo-advisor, which is basically just a nice way of saying an online algorithm. You'll go on to a website like Betterment and Wealthfront are two well-known ones. You'll enter in your information. They'll ask you maybe 20 questions, and then they'll say, okay, we put you in this investment allocation, and that's it, right? And again, it's not a bad choice. If your only goal is to open an investment account and start, then I think that's great. It doesn't give you a ton of support beyond that, right? On the opposite side, you have what we call the total support. And this is kind of the more traditional financial advisory service that you think of, which is Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Fidelity. You could potentially open an account here and get a human advisor to work with you. And they might do things like financial planning. They might talk to you about how you can set up your estate or do your investments. But because there's that human component and they're taking a lot of time to work with you, they charge you higher fees. So the downside here is you get higher fees. The upside is you sometimes get better service. Realistically, most residents aren't going this path because frankly, your finances are not that complicated right now. And even if you wanted to, unless your parents have an existing relationship and the advisor is going to work with you as a favor, you're probably not going to get the time that you need from an advisor because you just have too small of an account or wealth to make it worth their time. Or you're going to get the newest advisor on the block who doesn't have a ton of experience. So
I think one thing to note here is it's not you have to do everything at once. Some people will have a do-it-yourself portion of money that they call their play money, but then their investments that they actually can't afford to lose or want to use for growth, they may do more of a hybrid or investment only as a resident. The other thing is, as you get more money, maybe you do move to the total service or total support someday, but you may not need it right now. You probably don't need estate planning, financial planning when you're in your 30s, but you may need it when you're in your 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I also think that people sometimes do a hybrid of both of them, where they'll have maybe the do-it-themselves, kind of like you said, play money, but then they'll also have their long-term investment money with one of these companies, right? Exactly. The last area, which is kind of the area that Aloola actually sits in, and now Vanguard and Schwab are also moving in as other companies are as well, is what we call hybrid. And it's basically combining robo-advisory technology with total support human components. So you basically can set up an account get some of the benefits of having the technology. But then when push comes to shove, if you have a financial question outside of just that investment account, you can actually talk to someone. We obviously think that's the best model. We are all obviously biased, but I think the key takeaway here is there's no right or wrong answer. It's just based on who you are and what your preference is. And like Caroline said, at the end of the day, this is your money. So you can move it around and shift it as time progresses, but you should really kind of consider where you're best suited and not just jump into anyone just because your friend's doing it or a family member told you that that's where they have their money.
The next topic we want to touch on was taxes, because you're a current resident, you probably already felt this. Your income increases, but you are considered a high income earner, even though you may not feel that way. So we just wanted to talk about different types of
I should say you will be a higher income earner as intended. You're probably not as high of an income earner as a resident.
We want to talk about some of the different types of accounts, because obviously this is an area that a lot of people say, okay, I want to start investing. What type of account should I be opening and what are the differences between them? The one on your left is a retail account. This is an individual or joint account. It's just a regular investment account that you can take money from without getting penalized at any time. Of course, if you have gains, you may have to pay taxes, but it's a pretty simple account and you can just invest. Usually people use this for more short-term goals. So if you're saving for a house, for example, and you don't want your money locked up until you retire, you may open a retail account. The other types of accounts we have there, IRAs or 403b/401ks, are retirement accounts. So there are, as Rob said, a lot of terms that get thrown out. So you've probably heard IRA, Roth IRA, 401k, 403b. It can sound complicated, but at its core, they're all retirement accounts. It's just what type and how they work. We'll actually start with the 403b, 401k. So this is a retirement account, and some of you may already have these through your employer or hospital. So they're virtually the same. There are little differences, but if you're working for a nonprofit, they're going to call it a 403b. If you're working for a corporation, it'll be a 401k. But they're retirement accounts through your company. And essentially, you choose how much you want to contribute through your payroll. And the big advantage of these types of accounts is that there hopefully is a match. So some money that you're getting, free money essentially, from that hospital or employer. And if there isn't a match, then you may want to talk to someone if it makes sense for you to invest or not, because as we talked about before, usually the only things you can invest in these accounts, and it's not anything to do with your employer, it's government regulated, is ETFs or mutual funds. So they do tend to have higher fees. But of course, if you're getting that free money, it's worth paying a little bit of extra fee for that free money. Where we really want to concentrate today is talking about IRA accounts, or what we call Roth IRA accounts, because honestly, as residents or young individuals starting your career, Roth IRA is probably the most important account to open if possible. These are, again, retirement accounts. They're just not associated with a company or employer, so they're outside protection accounts.
One of the things you should know is the IRA accounts, which is the one that's circled, you don't have to open that through your employer, like Carol Ann said. You do need to have income, though. So if you have income and your spouse does not have income, there is an exception where you can contribute for your spouse as well, but one of you needs to have income. And if you have a 403b, that's just through your employer, so you obviously have income. But that's one of the things that sometimes people call us and say, hey, can I open a outside IRA account? And the answer is, as long as you have income, yes, or your spouse has income, then yes.
Yeah. I wanted to illustrate how these accounts work. There's two types, as you can see, traditional IRA or Roth IRA listed, and really it has to do with the tax benefit. The government really wants people to save for retirement, so they give a tax break in order to encourage you to do that. However, they limit how much you can put in because they don't want to not get paid at all or get paid a lot less. So you can only put $6,000 in a year unless you're over 50, and then you can put $7,000 in. We just wanted to run through an illustration to kind of show the differences in when the taxes happen. So with a Roth IRA, it's called after-tax retirement account, and a traditional IRA is pre-tax. So let's again use an illustration, since that's what Rob and I like to do. To keep things simple, we'll just use a salary of $100,000. So let's say that both Rob and I make $100,000. I'm going to invest in a Roth IRA, and Rob's going to invest in a traditional IRA. So we both contribute $6,000 into those IRAs this year, which is the maximum amount we can put in. And when we go to pay our taxes, since I contribute to the Roth IRA, I'm going to be taxed on my full income. The government still says, okay, you made $100,000 on your W-2, and therefore, let's just say you're going to pay $25,000 in tax. Rob, on the other hand, since he put in a traditional IRA, when he goes to pay taxes, the government actually says, No, he didn't make 100,000. He only made 94,000 because that 6,000 that he put into the traditional IRA actually lowered his taxable income. When he goes to pay taxes this year, he actually pays less than me and would save $1,500 worth in taxes. However, let's say that we let those accounts grow and now we're both 65 and we want to start taking from them. And they've grown from that 6,000 we put in to now 50,000. So they both have a gain of 44,000. When I go to pull out that 4,000 worth of gain, which is the difference between what I put in and what it grew to, that 50,000, I pay zero in taxes. So essentially all that growth is tax-free for me. Rob, on the other hand, since he already got the tax benefit, has to pay the taxes on all of that growth. So he's going to pay $6,600 worth of taxes. So neither one is wrong. You're getting the tax benefit in both. If you aren't going to be touching the money for a retirement for a while, which most people probably on this webinar are in that case, it makes a lot of sense to start that Roth IRA and to let it grow for you and get all that tax benefit in the long run.
Yeah, I think if there's one takeaway of all the things we're going to say on this webinar today, it would be don't underestimate the power of the Roth IRA. And just to bring this home, we decided we'd throw another illustration because it's always fun doing extra math just to kind of prove this point. So one of the things we did here was we basically said, okay, if you're 30 years old and you save $5,000 each year, how much have you grown your wealth by when you retire at 60 years old, right? So in the first scenario, you just put all that money into a bank account and it's worth roughly $159,000. If you put it into a investment account, which is what we're qualifying in this slide as a retail account, so a non-retirement account, right? Then it grows because it's invested in the stock market to $510,000. And this third category is you put it into a 403B or a Roth IRA account, which is a retirement account, right? So you get that tax benefit. Because we're assuming we invest it the exact same way in the non-retirement retail investment account and the retirement 403B and Roth IRA account, your wealth is the same, right? It grows to $510,000. So nominally they look the same. However, when you go to pull that money out, the government is going to tax that investment account, whereas the Roth IRA is not going to be taxed. That's the advantage Carol Ann just went over in that last math example. So I think the big takeaways are, one, don't underestimate the power of compounding growth, and two, don't underestimate the power of Uncle Sam to tax you. But I think a lot of times people say, okay, this is great. I understand now the power of a Roth IRA and a 403B. The question here, and I apologize for switching the slides, I just think it's helpful to look at it. But the question is, which one should I prioritize, right? If my hospital offers me a 403B or 401k plan, and I have the option of opening an outside Roth IRA account, which one should I be doing? In general, what we advocate is if your company or hospital matches you, i.e. they give you that free money, you should definitely be prioritizing that first up to the match. So if they're going to match you up to 4% or 3%, make sure you're getting that full 4 or 3%, because it's just free money that if you don't invest in it, you're leaving money on the table. After that, then start prioritizing trying to get to the full $6,000 in your outside Roth IRA. And if your hospital doesn't match, then reverse the priority of those two. Start with the outside Roth IRA, and then when you've maxed out the $6,000, do the hospital 403B plan.
And I just want to note, because a lot of people say, aren't there income levels that keep me from contributing to, you might have heard this, to like a Roth IRA, or some people even think within their 403B, 401k. So there are income levels on how much, whether you can contribute to that Roth IRA or not, but there is an operation way that you can keep contributing even if you're over that income level. It just takes some extra paperwork. So talk to whoever you're working with and they should be able to help you there. And then the other thing I want to note is within the 403B, 401k, as you can see, that contribution limit is very different. So even if you're contributing within a Roth IRA within the 403B, which sounds complex, but that is an option, you can contribute more than $6,000.
Honestly, we're trying to give you a high level overview here, but it's often helpful to talk about your specific situation in detail, but hopefully this gives you a starting point. The next part is kind of the elephant in the room, which is the debt. Should you pay it off or should you be investing? Because a lot of people enter residency or go through residency with a lot of debt from either medical school or undergraduate education.
Yeah, and I think the dreaded answer is it depends. So we wanted to take this in looking at a few different things, looking at the financial aspect of it, as well as the emotional, and then what type of debt. Starting with the financial, the easiest way to kind of think about this on a financial level is whether paying off the debt or investing in the market is going to give you a higher return. So let's say that your interest rate of your debt is 10%, but you think that you can get in the market 12%, then obviously it makes sense to invest rather than be paying off your debt. However, if the opposite is true, where you think investing, you can only get 10%, but your interest rate is 12%, that obviously doesn't make sense. So then you should be paying off the debt rather than investing in the market. Now, obviously, no one knows exactly what the return of the market is going to be, but as we noted at the beginning of this webinar, it's usually around 7% averaging. So depending on your interest rate and depending on talking to experts such as ourselves or someone else, they can usually give you an estimate of where they think the market's going to be. Obviously, no one has a crystal ball, but that might help you with figuring out whether you want to invest or pay off your debt. The emotional part is something you can't underestimate. I am a type of person who really hates debt no matter what. Even if it makes sense for me to be investing versus paying off my debt, I'm probably still going to pay off more of my debt than invest, just because I sleep better at night not having as much debt. Rob, on the other hand, is a bigger risk taker. He's probably going to do the analysis and go more within the market than paying off his debt in most cases. So you do need to take in that emotional factor and not just say, well, just because the financial people say I should invest, that's what I'll do, even though I can't sleep at night. And then the last part way to think about this is what type of debt it is. Pay off that credit card debt as fast as possible rather than invest. When you get to student debt, it becomes more of a gamble, obviously based on your interest rate, whether it's private or public, things like that. And then when you think of things like a mortgage, which is technically debt, you may actually not want to pay that off as much because you're getting the tax benefit from having that mortgage and paying that interest. So in that case, even though you may be able to make more in the market, even though it may seem like it's beneficial to pay it off, you may not want to because of the tax benefit. So the way to think about this is what type of debt it is and not treat them all equally, right? Rank them.
Yeah, and just like you were saying, with a mortgage obviously has an advantage, unlike other debt where the interest you pay on it is tax deductible. So that gives you a financial advantage as well. But similarly, the type of investment account that you're putting money into also matters. So it's not only the debt side, it's also the investment side. For example, if I choose not to put the maximum $6,000 into a Roth IRA, because it gives you such a big tax advantage, like you said, the government limits how much money you can put into it because they don't want to lose out on all their tax revenue. So as a result, if I don't put $6,000 into my Roth IRA this year, next year I don't get to put up $12,000. Don't get to make up that difference. So essentially, you're not doing a simple calculation of what do I think I'll get in the market in my Roth IRA return next year versus what I pay my interest on my debt next year. You're really saying, what do I think that $6,000 that I put in this year will get compounded over the next 30 years? And that's a different calculation, right? So oftentimes it does make sense to say, hey, I'm going to put a little bit into my Roth and pay off my debt rather than just only focus on the debt.
Yeah, I think that's a big point, is it doesn't have to be one or the other. A lot of people will be investing, even if it's just a little bit, as we talked about before, and paying off their debt at the same time.
So we're going to, again, talk about this relatively quickly for a pretty complex topic, just because we realize that it's not going to apply to everyone on this webinar. But one of the things we've noticed is that a lot of residents, especially because you are often relocating or recently moved to a city for a multi-year period of time as you complete your residency and potentially fellowship, people consider buying a house, right? It's something that most people on this webinar have done or will be doing in the next decade, probably. So we thought we'd just kind of address the good and bad, because we often find that a lot of people throw out generic statements about buying a home, like, why would I pay rent when I can pay my stuff? And that kind of oversimplifies something that's a lot more complex. But just looking at two of the big advantages of a home are that, unlike something like a car, which decreases in value over time, historically, assuming you buy in a relatively good real estate area or market or geography, as an asset, the value of it will go up over time. It also diversifies you a bit. If you think about your total financial picture, you have some of your income or wealth tied to the hospital and your job. You will hopefully have some of your wealth and income derived from the stock market. And now buying a house diversifies you into real estate as well, right? So it gives you that diversification. And then the second big advantage that Carol already addressed is you take out a mortgage to buy a house, the interest that you pay is actually tax deductible. So it helps you financially on your taxes somewhat. The negative, which people don't really talk about, is that in general, the housing market does not grow nearly as fast as the stock market over time, right? So it depends on where you're looking. And over the last year or two, it's actually been quite an anomaly, partially because of where interest rates went and the quarantine. But typically, the housing market might grow by, say, 3% or 4% a year. That's a big difference compared to the 7 to 10% we've seen in the stock market over different historical time periods. As a result, you generally want to have a longer time frame when you buy a house because, like the stock market, the housing market is susceptible to pullbacks or recessions. You can think about 2008 when the crisis was actually spurred by the real estate market. If you bought a house and had planned to sell it in 1 year, well, you might have bought a house for $100,000, and when you go to sell it, it's only worth 70. So you need to have a longer time frame because it basically reduces the risk of you selling it at a lower price than you bought it at. One of the things we thought would be helpful is illustrate the idea of home equity, because this is the real reason people buy houses, is to build equity, which is just another way of saying what your ownership is in the house that you buy. Because even though people say you own the home, technically the bank owns a large portion of that home through the mortgage. So if you buy a house, let's just say for $200,000, and you do what most Americans do and put down 20% for that house, you would put down $40,000 of your hard-earned money, and then you take out a loan or a mortgage from the bank for $160,000. So the equity in the house is $40,000, but it's not really the type of equity you want because you technically worked for every dollar you put down, right? Let's just say, again, after a certain amount of time, the house value has not increased at all, but you've been paying your mortgage down over time. So let's just say you applied another $30,000 towards your mortgage. Well, now your equity has grown to $70,000, but once again, it doesn't feel that great because every dollar you put into the house built your equity, but you had to work for that dollar, right? The third, and this is kind of the version that people like to think about when they buy houses, is the value of the house has actually increased over time. So again, you've still paid down that $30,000 into your mortgage. You have your $40,000 that you put in on the initial deposit, but the value of the house has grown as well. So now you have an extra $50,000. And this is the type of equity everyone really wants because, as you were going to work, as you were sleeping at night, the value was going up and basically earning you money. In this scenario, your equity's grown to $120,000. One of the things I should point out before we move on is that as a resident, you, unlike most Americans, with the exception of potentially military veterans, have the ability to actually put down very little on houses, almost 0% depending on the bank. And it's called a physician mortgage. Essentially what it is banks allow you, because they know that you're not earning a lot right now, but you will be earning probably six figures in the future, and you tend to be really good long-term clients, and they want you to talk to your other friends at the hospital and get them to become banking clients as well. They're willing to say, hey, we know you don't have a ton of money or income right now, but if you want to buy this house, we'll let you put down 0% down or 10% down without a penalty. And that's pretty incredible because typically if people put down less than 20%, they pay a penalty, which is called PMI. It's basically an extra insurance charge because the bank is taking more risk to put down or give you the larger mortgage because you're not putting your own money in. Whereas as a physician or as a resident, you don't have to do that. So that is an option that a lot of people consider. And it's one way that you're able to buy a house earlier than you otherwise would if you had to save up for that 20%. We're not going to really address too much of this, but the idea here is that buying a house is a complicated process. There's lots of players and there's lots of protocol and kind of steps. So I think having a financial support team or an advisor or someone who can walk you through it and talk about some of the advantages or tactics or strategies is helpful. Obviously, your real estate agent is best positioned to do this, but often it's also helpful to have a financial advisor who's part of that team and helping you make that big life decision. The thing about buying a home is oftentimes people just think of the initial down payment as something they need to save on. We thought this slide is helpful because it helps highlight the fact that there are additional costs. When you buy a house, you have to pay for a company to come out and appraise the value of the house. You have to pay the bank, underwrite the mortgage or give you that. They have to be paid for their time. You have to pay a title agency, which is essentially a company that looks at the history of the house to make sure that whoever's selling it to you actually owns the house and hasn't gambled it away in Vegas or something else. So you have all these extra costs that come out. And we generally say you should estimate 2 to 5% of the home value as closing costs on top of your down payment. If you buy an HOA or a condominium community, there's additional fees. If you buy an older house and you want to buy insurance on the utilities of the house in case they break down, that might be extra money. And then you also have extra taxes. So we put this one down as an example of what's in Philadelphia, where we actually live, there's a 4.3% city tax, right? And that's a lot of money. And that actually is part of the negotiation where you can decide, is the seller going to pay that? Is the buyer going to pay that? But it's something that you need to consider and figure out, does your local municipality or area have any similar taxes or state? So a lot of people say, wow, that's a lot of money. How am I possibly going to pay for this, especially on my resident salary? And we thought we'd just throw out examples of some things you may consider. So the first is IRA. We've talked a lot about how IRAs are retirement accounts, and you really can't touch the money until you are retired or you're going to be penalized with extra taxes. There is an exception, though, for first-time home purchases, where you can actually take out up to $10,000 without a penalty and apply it to the house. And if you have a spouse and they have an IRA, they can also take out $10,000, so a total of $20,000. A second avenue you can pursue is what's called a seller's assist. So let's just say that all the closing costs for your home are $15,000, and you were originally going to buy the house for $100,000, right? Well, if you don't have the extra $15,000, or frankly, you just don't want to put it up because it's going to make you too financially tight, you can go to the seller and say, look, I was going to pay you $100,000, but now I'm going to pay you $115,000, but I want you to pay my closing costs. From the seller's perspective, they don't care because they're still walking away with the same $100,000. As long as the bank will finance it with the larger mortgage, you're fine with it too, because basically you've taken $15,000 and you spread that cost over a 30-year mortgage. So maybe it increased your monthly payment by, making this up, $15 or $30, but that might be worth it to you rather than coming up with the money today. And then the last is if you're a veteran or a physician, which people on this call are, make sure you're taking advantage of the unique situations of how you can attain a mortgage compared to other Americans, because it often reduces your costs and may reduce how much you actually need to put down on your mortgage.
The last thing we wanted to hit on related to the house is something called tenants by entirety. And this is a pretty unique thing where you can just check a box essentially when you're buying a property and say that you want to have it in tenants by entirety. And what it really means is essentially, even though you jointly own this house with your spouse, and this can only be done with spouses, if you were ever to get sued, which is pretty common for doctors, unfortunately, they would say, no, you don't own the house, your spouse owns it. So let's say that my husband and I own the house, I'm a doctor and I get sued. They would say, no, Carolyn doesn't own that house, her husband does. And if my husband got sued, they would do the exact opposite. They would say, no, he doesn't own the house, Carolyn does. And so it's a way to protect this asset for homes. It can only be done in the states that are highlighted in blue, but there are a number of them. So you should check and see if it's a possibility. And as I said, it's really just checking a box when you buy the property in order to have extra protection. So the only way really you could lose that asset is if you both get sued. And if that's the case, unfortunately, you're just in a bad situation.
Yeah, we just highlight this because a lot of people either buy the house just in their name or they buy it as a joint ownership. And this is just basically another form of joint ownership. It just protects the asset a little bit better, especially for people who are in litigious industries, which unfortunately, I think the medical field now qualifies as.
We will go through this pretty quick because I know there are probably a number of people that this doesn't apply to, but if you have children or thinking of having children soon, as you can see from this illustration, education costs are just increasing like crazy. We keep waiting for that bubble to pop, but it hasn't happened yet. So probably do want to plan ahead. And one of the most popular vehicles to be saving for education is a 529. They're pretty simple. They have a lot of advantages in the sense that basically you get a tax benefit for using the money for education purposes. And education purposes is very broad. So it's not only tuition, it's room and board, computers, really any type of education. It can be used for trade school, it can be used for colleges, it can be used for grad school. If one child doesn't use it and they have a sibling, you can transfer it to the sibling. You can put in money, but you can also have grandparents or relatives put in money. So there's a lot of flexibility with it. And it's basically the government giving you an advantage for using it for education. The other thing that recently changed is that you can actually use a portion of it for high schools or elementary school. Obviously, we don't encourage that too much because you won't have as much savings because you don't have as long for growth. But this is a great vehicle if you have a young child or you're going to have children in the future. Some people wait until they're pregnant and then they open the 529 even before having the name of the child. You can make your spouse the beneficiary and then change it once they're born. So there's a lot of unique creativity to this that you should definitely be thinking about if it's a concern of yours to be saving for education.
Yeah, and again, I think this is one of those life events where, similar to a house, when you're having a kid, having a financial support team to talk through it is often helpful, because there are things like insurance and 529s and different investment accounts that you're going to want to adjust when you have kids or are planning on having kids.
So as Rob mentioned, life insurance is a big one. Again, as doctors, they will try to oversell you in insurance is what we've started to notice. And unless you have a spouse or a child, there's really no reason for you to have insurance, to be honest. It's more likely that you would want disability versus is life insurance, because it's more likely that you'll become disabled. If you are going to get insurance, think about what you want the insurance for. So if you're trying to get the insurance so that if something was to happen to you, your family could depend on it to either cover that mortgage or get your kids through college, or cover the nanny cost, or be able so your spouse could stay at home, whatever it is, that seems like you would probably need something called term insurance, which is basically insurance that is set for a set amount of time. So the most common type we see for residents is a 30-year term, which basically means your premium is set for 30 years. You pay it every year or every month, depending on how you want to do it. And essentially, if you die, that death benefit, whatever value you decided to get it at, will be paid out. And if you don't, then it just ends after that time period. It's very simple. There's not a lot of bells and whistles to it.
It tends to be lower cost, and a lot of times people will say, well, what about, why would I do 30 years if I die, in the 35th year, right? And the answer oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes is, well, in 30 years, your kids are adults, right? They're hopefully independent, they're earning their own incomes, and you simultaneously increase your own investment account, so your spouse may be better off. So you've accomplished what you need to, which is giving you your family protection during the most needed time frame.
Whole life insurance is what we call lifelong coverage, basically until you're 100 usually. And the premiums are a lot more expensive than term. Term is based on usually the younger you are, the cheaper it is, which is the same with whole life, but term is, because it's pretty set, it just tends to be a lot cheaper. Where whole life, because it's a lot longer time frame and there's a lot more variables that can happen during that, it's a lot more expensive. You really probably only want to look at whole life if there's some reason that you think, even if your children were grown, or even if your spouse was to have more investments later, they would still be dependent on it. And we can talk through, there's a lot more variables to whole life. So if that's something you're interested in, we can run illustrations or talk you through the different options to help you with figuring that out. But we just wanted a high level kind of given. Yeah,
and like Carol said, I think this is one of the areas that we often, unfortunately, see abuse in the industry, where we'll have residents come in and they're being oversold a lot of whole life insurance. And the reality is, no matter who sells you insurance, the way the industry works is they get paid a commission. That doesn't mean they're bad people, but just know that is an incentive. So like, if you're being sold insurance, you should make sure you're talking to someone you trust and figuring out, hey, is this the right amount of insurance? Is this the right premium? Am I overpaying? Am I underpaying? And figuring that out. Oftentimes, as an alternative to getting whole life, what people will often do as residents is they'll buy 30-year term life insurance, which is more affordable. But let's say that premium is $30 a month versus whole life, which is $150 a month. Again, using arbitrary numbers here. What they'll do is they'll buy the term life and pay the $30, but then they'll take the difference between that $30 and what they would have paid if they did the whole life, and they'll invest it. So the appeal of that is, after the 30 years, when your term life insurance is up, you now have this very large investment account that acts as a safety net if something were to happen. So you've protected yourself, but you now have full control over it. The problem you run into is a lot of people just don't actually end up investing the difference. They spend it. So you kind of have to know what your behavior is, but that is a pathway that a lot of people have had success with. Okay, so I think we are going to end it here just because we want to be cognizant of everyone's time. One of the things we did want to mention is, just because we are a financial education platform and we have very close relationships with lots of medical corporations and hospitals, we provide our services for free to all residents as long as you're in the US and in a residency program. A lot of people say, what's the point, right? Like, how do you actually make money? Our goal is honestly to at least provide financial literacy to as many people as you can, but also we would love to create a long-term relationship so that when you do become an attending and start having more complex wealth questions and investment questions, we're kind of your trusted team. And as a result, we're willing to kind of create that upfront investment in the relationship. So if you want to do a financial plan, if you want to start investing, if you just want to talk about having kids, buying a house, paying off debt, those are all the type of questions that We love working with people, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you have any questions that are more personalized that we didn't get to address today, because again, we realized that we kind of covered a lot of topics at a very high level, we're always happy to have a more in-depth conversation related specifically to you and your family.
And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much.